I'm going to speak today about American education. I'm looking from the blackboards to the computer world, and it's interesting to me, having started to teach in 1971, how the world has changed, and especially our public education system. So I invite you to take a journey with me. We're going to look at several different aspects of public education in the United States. My voice okay? I can be louder if you would like.
Teacher's voice.
Teacher voice, I can do that. Even my daughter, who's a teacher, will occasionally say to me, "Mom, you're inside, don't use the teacher voice." All right, Thomas Jefferson, our third president and drafter of the Declaration of Independence and founder of the University of Virginia, said, "Whenever people are well educated, they can be trusted with their own government." He also said that education creates responsible citizens. Furthermore, it is necessary for preserving democratic rights that we be educated. So, preview of coming attractions there. Columbo, the solver of all mysteries. All right. We're going to look first at the chronology of American education, a little timeline, look at some contemporary topics, challenges, and some conclusions that I have drawn. So here is a timeline. You don't need to read it directly because I'll go into each of these. But it gives us an idea. In the 1600s, we had our first laws in the American colonies, the British colonies, regarding education. One was the old Deluder Act, which I will speak on, and the other was the establishment.
Can you be over here?
Yes.
I'm sorry.
I can be any place you'd like. Is that better? Okay.
Margaret,
Huh?
speak slowly.
Huh?
Speak it just a little slower.
Thank you. Okay. I better get this going because I have 4 presentations in Asia. I leave tomorrow morning. Between now and December 3rd. I better slow down and get this act right. So you are sort of my test audience, and I appreciate this, all right?
We're old.
Well, so's your presenter. When I've done programs in India, I introduced myself and said, "I am older than independent India," and all these young people go, because I am. I'm 3 months older than when India became independent from the British. We're going to look at Boston Latin School all the way up through the last one we'll take is No Child Left Behind. But there will be changes in our education system. So during the era of colonization by the English, education differed between the colonies. It was not common through all of the English colonies. The first school ever established was what was called the Boston Latin School, and it is still in existence today. And in 1972, they had a remarkable thing happen. They allowed girls. Also at this time, the towns decreed that in a town, if there were more than 50 families, they had to have a public school. And it was the parents who subscribed. In other words, they purchased or they volunteered money to help support the teacher. In the northern colonies, girls from well-to-do families excuse me, went to what was called dame schools, and they learned, I love this curriculum, reading and writing, French, arithmetic, music, and dancing. In the South, males from wealthy family were taught by European tutors. And any additional education that they wanted for beyond basically what we would call high school, they were sent to England to go to school, primarily. Once the American Revolution occurred, we had a situation where public education becomes expanded. When you think about what the Declaration of Independence says, what the Constitution says about people's rights, it makes sense that public education would take on a very positive role. So textbooks become standardized. We have the famous Webster's Dictionary and the Speller and all of that. The themes I thought was very interesting. Patriotism, unification of the country, Secular morality, they did not include religion as such. Things like Aesop's fables would be taught, but not any kind of theology or doctrine. Is there a way we could move that over a little?
Pardon? Yeah, I don't know why it's doing that. I can't get it to change that.
Okay.
Sorry.
It's a good thing I remember a lot of it. Horace Mann is considered the founder of public education in the United States. And in the 1830s, he proposed that all public schools be free and available to all children. Now, of course, there's a caveat in this, isn't there? Which we will look at. Because he believed it was the great equalizer of the condition of men. Obviously, something else missing from this equation. At the middle part of the 19th century, we had, of course, the Civil War. And as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation and the constitutional amendments 13, 14, and 15, there was a movement to educate the formerly enslaved. Prior to that time, it was a serious crime if you educated an African American, if you taught them to read. It was a punishable crime. Didn't mean people didn't do it, but very few and far between. So there were separate schools for blacks and whites. And they were significantly, obviously, going to be inferior when we look at it. In 1896, the case went to the Supreme Court. It was known as Plessy versus Ferguson. And the ruling will come down with this decision. It said if they were equal, these schools could be separate. Now, take a look at those two pictures. This is not in the 1890s. This is in the 1950s, in the same particular state, who shall remain nameless. As you look at both of these classrooms, I think it's pretty clear that separate was not equal. So in 1954, there was a Supreme Court case that overturned Plessy. Plessy said schools could be segregated on race, provided they offered equal educational opportunities. They could be separate, but equal. But since they were not equal when they were separate, the Supreme Court overturned this in the Brown decision. They ruled that since schools weren't equal, they couldn't be separate. And it's the birth of the civil rights movement and the birth of integration of our schools. I found this very interesting about mandatory attendance. In 1918, all students of an appropriate age, elementary age, would be up to about 14, were required to go to school. 1918, my father was a year old in 1918. Prior to that time, it was not mandatory. But we're in the midst of our involvement in World War I. Might be a significant connection. 1936, all students of the appropriate ages must attend secondary school. We're in the midst of the Great Depression. It was one way to keep young men out of the workforce, by making them go to high school, making it mandatory. So in 1900, we had a 6% population who graduated from high school. In 1945, it had gone to 57%. By 2020, it had gone to 87% graduation rate of high school in this country. In 1965, Lyndon Johnson, who was a former teacher himself, encouraged Congress to pass what was called the Every Student Succeeds Act. And what he believed was that students who were from high-need environments and disadvantage needed to have equal access, even though the Brown decision had been overturned 21 years before. It was not effective in the long run. So it became what we call the title programs, Title I, Title II, Title III, et cetera. And each one was a specific thing. Up until the time of this, monies were not spent on girls' athletics. The money was devoted to male athletics. It was not to girls. This is what changed it. So No Child Left Behind, which was in 2001, states that schools must be held accountable for how students learn and achieve. The issue I have with that is it's based on a premise that children are machines. And for any of us who have worked with children or have given birth to them or been around them, know they're not machines. So the assumption, like machinery, if I turn it on and I do the right stuff, it's always going to turn out the same product. Doesn't happen with children. It's a faulty premise that we began with on that particular piece of legislation. So we're going to shift our perspective. We're going to look at something else. The purpose of American education, American public education, the very first ruling was during the time of the colonial period in New England, and it's called the Puritan Old Deluder Act. It's our first piece of legislation as a country. And the Old Deluder was a term for the devil. And they believed at this time that you had to teach children to read, not write, not spell, just read, so they could read the Bible and keep the old deluder at bay. Keep them away because you're reading the Word of God. That was the main reason why we educated back in those days. In the very early years of our nationhood, the focus was on creating good citizens. That's what schools were supposed to do, create good citizens. As we move to the time of the era of the Common Man, about 1830, it's the idea of equality for all. That's the next reason why we educate in public schools. And lastly, in the post-industrial and full industrial time, we wanted to make productive workers. That was the focus of school. So you see a real shift from one to the next to the next. It is my opinion, which you may or may not agree with, that schools today are expected to be all things to all people. In earlier times, the mandate was clear. I teach you to read because you have to be able to read the Bible so the devil doesn't get you, okay? Today's schools are designed, or are expected, I should say, to foster opportunity of life skills, job training, good citizenship, critical and creative thinking, technology, healthy behaviors, and a myriad of other functions. I'm going to think about that. That's just part of what the expectation for our public school system is. So, here are some of the issues that face education today in the United States. And there's no particular order to these. And some of them I'll talk about in more depth. Lack of parental involvement. You know, mom used to go to the school and help out. Doesn't happen anymore. She has to go to work outside the home. Overcrowding in schools and classrooms. Lack of diversity in our gifted education. Poor student health. Stagnant school spending. Well, you should be able to do what you did 5 years ago on the same amount of money, but today. I don't know. I go to the grocery store and I can't spend what I got, can't buy what I bought 5 years ago. Why should that be this different in education? Outdated teacher training, and I'll talk about this a little later. Technology brings a new dimension to cheating. Well, I Googled it. Yes, well, that doesn't mean it's right. We've had higher dropout rates in recent years. Great need for assistive technology for students with disabilities. This could be such a thing as books that they can hear instead of read if they have a difficulty with reading. School security, we certainly know that that's a big topic throughout the United States with the loss of how many lives of young people who've been in schools that have had shootouts. Issues of race, ethnicity, and civil rights. Mainstreaming. National standards and Common Core. Remote learning, we saw that during COVID. Equality versus equity in funding. Equality is everybody gets the same. Equity is everybody gets what they need. So you don't buy winter coats for kids living in Hawaii, but the ones living in Maine need the winter coat. Teacher salaries, charter schools, and having a business model for education. Has to make a profit, a better commercial venture. So, the previous lists are just some of the general problems that we face in education today. Within the classroom, there are other issues that we need to look at that affect and affect education. 1966, a report was written by a professor named Coleman, and I've had the privilege of reading it, and he identifies key predictions of student success. What's very interesting is his study has been duplicated, I want to say as recently as like 2017. And his conclusions that he drew in 1966 are the same. So, your socioeconomic status is a predictor of student success, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. The family background in education, the higher the parents' education, students tend to be better performers in schools. Not all, not ever, but it's a pattern. The parents' attitude, the family attitude toward education. I had a case when I was a young teacher who said, well, he doesn't need to know this, he's going to work on the farm. Okay. And teacher effectiveness. But what you notice here, 3 of them deal with the families. They deal with the families and the system of how the family approaches education. So, compilation of data. When you see this, please understand there is no pop quiz at the end, okay? I'm simply having the facts so that it makes sense, the mathematics of it. So, this is from the California State Department of Education, and it says, oh Lord, that's not what it looked like originally. Okay, let me see if I can remember from mine. The highest performing schools are La Jolla, Cupertino, San Marino. Can you see what the other ones are?
Can't try to get up. I don't know. Sorry.
Well, that's okay. We'll just go with those 3 for right now. What we notice is they have very low poverty rates, between 2 and 5% in those school districts. If we look at the lowest performing, San Bernardino, Sacramento, San Diego, and 2 more, that have an average of 13 to 14% poverty. So I think there's a connection between the two, between the poverty of an area and the performance of the kids. And poverty can mean a variety of things. It's not simply the economics, but that plays a big part in it. This looked really good when I made it, by the way. All right, so if we look at my hand-drawn chart here, the highest performing schools had between 1 and 4% poverty. The lowest performing schools had between 13 and 16% poverty, 4 times the highest. I think there's a connection. So what I would like to do now, you can hold on to your colored cards. You have your cards, everybody, right? Mm-hmm. Aren't you excited? We're going to do the colored cards now. You wondered what I was thinking, huh? All right. Would the people who have pink cards...
Margaret, maybe some people need to get cards. They can get them.
Oh, then we ran out. Did we run out? Okay. Whoever people who don't have them, can you pass them out to them? Thank you. See, this is the group participation portion of our program. That's for Kathy. Okay, anybody else still need one? Okay, if you have a pink card, would you raise your hand? If you have a pink card, you represent 7% of the group, and you have dyslexia. 1 in 14 people have dyslexia.
1 in 14. 1 in 14.
1 in 14. 7% of the population. Those of you who have blue cards, would you raise your cards, please? You have dysgraphia, and I'm going to talk about each one of these. You represent 1 in 8 students, or 12% of the population. Those of you who have yellow cards, would you raise your hand? You have dyscalculia. That sounds kind of creepy, though. It isn't, but it sounds kind of creepy. You are 1 in 14 students, or 7%, who have dyscalculia. And those who have a green card, I'm not referring to naturalization and immigration, okay? You are one in 11 students, or 9%, who have dyspraxia. And I'll explain what each one of these means. Now, everybody has a card. Would you raise your hand? Raise your card up, everybody who has a card. Out of 100, if there were 100 people here, you would represent a classroom. This is out of 100 people. If there were 100 people here, take a look around you. And we haven't even looked at the behavioral issues. We've only looked at the ones that deal with, some of the ones that deal with perception, how you process information. Anybody find that scary? Enlightening, but scary, okay. In the past, the only limitations on learning were if you were blind, deaf, or you couldn't speak. Intellectual deficiencies were identified on the Stanford-Binet test for IQ, which most of us took because it was still in vogue at the time we were in elementary school. You were a moron, an idiot, or an imbecile. That was the bottom line. Genius was the top, and these were the bottom line. Less than 60 points on the test. Today, as we look at learning disabilities, we have to consider them kind of holistically. Some are perceptual and some are behavioral. Almost all of the major learning disabilities can be traced to birth and delivery, genetics, or the environment. Let me explain. When we talk about birth or delivery, a high incidence of children with disabilities had drugs or alcohol from one or both parents. And yes, gentlemen, the sperm of somebody who's been using drugs or alcohol is affected. It's not just the mother carrying the baby. Complications such as during delivery, such as the loss of oxygen. I know of a case of a woman who her IQ is about 20 points lower than her siblings because there was an oxygen issue when she was being born. 20 points difference from her siblings. According to the National Institutes of Health, children who have a parent with a learning disability are more likely to develop a learning disability themselves. So there's obviously a genetics involved in this. Some of the environmental factors include such things as nutrition, both prenatally and at the current time. Fortunately, the federal government and state governments have stepped up healthy meals and snacks for kids in school. That at least helps a little bit. All right, exposure to lead, both in paint and water, same thing. These have been banned back in California banned lead-based paint back in the 70s because they found it was having effects on children. Poor support for intellectual development. I can't give away what I don't have. If I haven't had the opportunity to be educated and intellectually alive, I can't give that away. So what we have found is the federal government stepped up during Johnson's time and created a program called Head Start, which takes children who have come from disadvantaged areas, primarily socioeconomically areas, and provides them with a preschool program because parents can't afford to do that for them. So Head Start is the most successful federal program of all times. The most successful. Now we've got over 50 years of documentation. Children who go through that have a higher chance of finishing high school and attending college and graduating from college than the same demographic who did not have this. It's an incredible program. So let's look at a working definition for disability. It affects the acquisition of knowledge or skills, in particular various neurodevelopmental conditions. Now, I've bold-faced, highlighted, and changed the color for neurodevelopmental for a reason. And that is because every one of these is something with the brain. Learning disability, which was referred to as LD, does not mean lazy and dumb. There is something, some glitch in the brain that produces these. So, the major type of perceptual disorders are ones that students have difficulty understanding or using spoken or written language, doing mathematical calculations, coordinating movements, and being attentive and focused. So there's two types of programs for students with learning disabilities that are perceptual. One is called modifications, the other is called accommodations. And modifications means that you change what is expected of the student. For example, a child who is wheelchair bound cannot be expected to do the 1-mile race around the campus. That's unrealistic. So you find something that they can do and be successful at that accomplishes pretty much what you had hoped. Accommodations are alterations in environment, curriculum format, or equipment so that the student pursues the regular course of study. It's just making adaptations. Again, the example of books on tape, where instead of reading the textbook, they listen to it. That's an accommodation. Individual education plans, IEP, outlines what the student's present status or performance is, what are the goals for development, what are specific services that are going to be used, what are procedures for evaluating their accomplishments. Once the initial benchmarks have been reached and accomplished, if time remains in the school year, either a follow-up IEP is created or they're signed off that they've accomplished the things that they've needed. For example, I have a grandchild who had to go for speech therapy for a year, and within a year she accomplished the goals. So she doesn't have to go anymore. That doesn't necessarily, they're different depending upon the learning disability. So, my little collection of lesser-known facts from the National Center for Educational Statistics. Of students with learning disabilities, 65% are male, 35% are female. That pesky little Y chromosome. In our public schools, 40% of special education jobs go unfilled. Now, we've looked at how many people, how many children need these services, and 40% of these jobs aren't filled. The states with the highest, and IDEA stands for Individuals with Disabilities Act, Education Act, which was passed in 1990. The states that have the highest application of this include Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, New York, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Delaware, Wyoming, Oklahoma, and New Mexico. I was going to say North Mississippi, but I knew that didn't sound right, or maybe it was. States with the lowest implementation of this act include Idaho, Colorado, Texas. California is at 13%. The average otherwise was 12%. So, a couple of explanations. There could be a environmental issue. I know when I arrived in the valley, they were still burning the rice. I know how that affected my breathing, so I had to assume that it affected a lot of people's breathing. If I'm struggling to breathe, I'm not getting enough oxygen up here. All right? Sometimes local citizens are reluctant to acknowledge the existence of learning disabilities. These are the part of the LD means lazy and dumb. So we've had our cards. I found this fascinating when I did the research for this. Regular class size in the United States is 18 to 24 students in elementary school. High school, it can be larger or smaller, depending upon like upper level foreign language or upper level science. California has 24.2. The only two states that have more is Utah and Oregon. So if you look at the 50 states, 47 have better record on this than California, Oregon, and Utah. The national average for students with learning disabilities is 15% of students nationally. 15. I think that works out to 1 in 7. That's 7.3 1.3 million children in our schools. Nationally, the special education class is 17.1%. In California, they established a maximum, which sounded good until you realize it was 28 students was the maximum size of class you could have for special ed. Doesn't seem very fair to me. All right, in standardized testing, only math and language are used. Language arts are used to be evaluated when we have the national testing for Common Core and things like that. Schools that have a highly mobile population do not do as well because the students haven't been there since the first day of class. Even the Department of Defense recognized that, and their schools throughout the world where there are American bases use the same curriculum in the same week. So you could go from Cucamonga to East Kushkandargi, and it would have, it's week 3 of month 4. It's the same curriculum. Now, that makes sense. So let's look more specifically at some of the perceptual learning disabilities. They are dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, dyspraxia, auditory processing, and executive functioning. And I'll give you examples and explanations of each of these. Again, all of these are present in our classrooms. And there are many more. These are the most common. So, dyslexia is a neurodevelopmental condition that affects the ability to read, spell, and to write. Dyscalculia is the same thing but with numbers. So I'm going to show you an example. I want you to envision what you think a child with dyslexia sees. That's what they see, depending upon the form of the pattern. It can be blurry, it can be a seesaw effect, it can be washed out, it can be shaky. All of those are perceptions that students with dyslexia have. You think you could read those? I'd be hard-pressed. Pretty powerful stuff. On the left, dyscalculia is the way that people without that disorder see numbers. On the right is how someone with that disorder sees numbers. So dyscalculia is a little like dysgraphia, but with numbers versus letters. Dysgraphia, again, neurological condition that limits the ability to write clearly. Writing appears to be distorted or incorrect. Dyspraxia deals with fine motor skills. You know, we know in the development of children, they're able to do certain things at certain times. But if they don't reach those benchmarks, such as being able to tie your shoes by the time you're 7, but my theory is that's why Velcro was invented. I know this from personal experience. So let's take a look at this. The dysgraphia on the left, dyspraxia on the right. If they're not able to tie their shoes by the age, for example, of 7, there may be an issue with their fine motor skills. Auditory processing. The ears and the brain don't connect. They'll hear something different than what's being said. Executive functioning disrupts a person's ability to manage their own thoughts, emotions, and actions. Another aspect of it, but I ran out of space, is organizational issues. Being able to take information and put it into some kind of system or sequence or something that makes sense to them. That's the problem somebody with that disability has. It's very difficult for them to see how things are related to one another. So if I have auditory processing, the word flamenco and the word flamengo sound alike. So I'm either a Spanish dancer or a couple of birds. This is the best representation I could find of what the brain of someone with a severe case of executive function disorder. That's what their brain looks like. Try to access information when that's the way your brain looks inside. Behavioral learning disabilities. Sidebar, several of the previous perceptual and several of the behavioral have what is called comorbidity. It is not unusual for a child to have one or more. So they might have ADHD and dyslexia. Now, think about that. So the ones we're going to look at in terms of behavioral, again, these are the major ones. They're, I could do a whole thing just on this, but I won't. Attention deficit disorder, attention deficit with hyperactivity, autism spectrum disorder, and oppositional defiance disorder. These are the more common ones. We used to call number 4 just a bad kid, which is really sad when you realize it's a neurological disease. It's a neurological, it's in their brain. It's not a choice. This is the way their brain is wired. So, attention deficit disorder, trouble paying attention. Hello, are you there? Come on, I want eyes on me, all right? Their behaviors occasionally are impulsive because they don't think ahead to the idea of what's the consequence of this? If I make this choice, what might happen? It is neurological. It cannot be cured. It can be managed, but it cannot be cured. Oh, let me go back for a second. If you look at the cartoon there, and I spend a great amount of time finding the clip art that I think is appropriate, and there's an actual reason for this. I think in picture. I call myself an academic thinker. I think in picture. I remember the picture, not necessarily the words. And I figured there might be 1 or 2 people out here who operate the same way. So here's the one girl reading her book, just like she's supposed to, and the one. Okay. Attention deficit disorder subset with constant motion. Here's the teacher writing on the board, and this kid's trying to catch a butterfly, because that caught their attention. And these are the kids who years ago simply dropped out of school. I have members of my family that fit this, left at grade 10. The autism spectrum disorder, and the reason we use the word spectrum is because it's an extensive disorder in how it manifests. How many of you remember the movie Rain Man with Dustin Hoffman? Okay, that's a real severe case. That's a real severe case. A mild case used to be called Asperger's syndrome. But we use the concept of a spectrum now, that we don't use those terms. There's something in the brain that doesn't hook up the way that for other people it does. They have trouble with social communication. They don't pick up on social cues. Their behaviors seem odd to people around them because they are, their behaviors. We think there is a genetic and or environmental. Seems to be a genetic from the reading I have done. But you can't rule out if, living in a town with poisoned wells. So, it's possible. Oppositional defiance disorder. I thought that she was just a perfect picture for this. Uncooperative, argumentative, belligerent, and hostile toward parents, peers, and other authority figures. I've had them in my classroom. We think there again are environmental or genetic components to this. The teacher, because education comes down to the teacher in many cases. So in any given week, the typical teacher works 54 hours of a 40-hour week. Includes instructional time, supervision, planning, faculty department meetings, professional development, conference with the parents, conference with the kids, conference with the principal. In the average week of a 40-hour week, a teacher works 54 hours. So when people say, well, you get 3 months of the year off, actually you don't. Because this works out to 48 and a half weeks the teachers work in a given year. That's not including the time where they either teach summer school, go to summer school for professional development, or having a second job to supplement their salary. And many of us did it. So, here here are my conclusions. First and foremost, in the past, we have emphasized content, and skills have been kind of thrown up by the side. Education today has to be transferable skills. There's no point in having students memorize facts from the past to help them in the future. That's not going to help them. They have a laptop. They put in how many people lived in ancient Rome in the year 100. They don't have to remember that. They have access, so they have to know how to do the access. That's the skill. That's where the training should be going. Being able to manipulate the data is critical, and being able to understand what is legitimate information and what is not. So you're using an aspect of critical thinking. Well, I saw it on the internet. It reminds me that, yes, Virginia, there is a Santa Claus because it was in the Times. Moreover, I think that education must provide opportunities for individuals who are thinkers, critical thinkers, creative thinkers, and systems thinkers. Communicators, reading, writing, speaking, listening, and digitally proficient. And problem-solving decision makers. I came up with this list in 1997, before I started my doctoral studies. I just wanted to see if I could predict if I felt the same way after my studies. And I do. So, security has to be a priority in our schools. Well, it won't happen here. I've been in schools where principals said that. It won't happen here. And then it did. It must be promoted within the school community for the health and safety of all. We have to respect all forms of diversity in our schools because it's critically important we have equality of opportunities and equity of instruction in every school that we have in the United States. And when we talk about diversity, we're dealing with issues of socioeconomics, we're dealing with culture, ethnicity, age, religion, gender identity, sexual orientation, and the list goes on. Diversity used to just mean race. And there's only one race that's called human. Yeah, skin color may be different. I mean, there are frozen turkeys with more color than I have. We have to have different forms of assessment. It cannot be just the fill in the blank. Now, I grant you, it was a real easy way to correct because I ran it through that machine. And I had my grades done like this. Well, when you had 160 students, that made some level of sense, but it was not the most effective or appropriate way to assess students. So we can assess them through performance art. We can do it through oral presentations. One of the things that I have always wondered about, students since I started teaching, I think it was usually first grade, made an igloo out of sugar cubes. Okay? The students in Alaska don't do that. That made me wonder why suburban California students were doing that. It makes no sense. I have a friend I grew up with who taught second grade in Alaska, and she says, "Why are you doing that?" And I said, "I don't have an answer." So what we ask the students to do in performance art or non-traditional assessment has to be relevant. Building an igloo out of ice cubes when you live in a temperate climate is not relevant to anything. So traditionally, some mothers who worked as volunteers in the schools. And today, the percentage of mothers who work outside the home, mothers of school-aged children, 71.2% of women with school-aged children work outside the home. So they're not available to work in the schools like they used to. However, there are ways in which both parents can support their children's education. They can assist with homework, especially when you're talking elementary level. They can model pleasure reading. My dad was a reader. That's something I saw him do in the evening when he came home from work. He'd watch the news and then he'd sit down and read for an hour or so. Emphasize the importance of education. This is your job when you're 10 years old. You take it seriously. You dress accordingly. You present your materials appropriately. And, perhaps the most important in today's world, monitor media access and content. There's a very good world out there in media, but there's some very bad dark spaces as well. So I also suggest that there be a restructuring of the way we prepare people to become teachers. And I was part of that at the State University of New York, because what happens is someone new comes in and their specialty is fill in the blank. Oh, we need to have classes of fill in the blank now. We just got out of hand. It was like bad yeast that just sent it exploding. There was no continuity in our program, so we totally dismantled it. And we started literally from the ground up of what things we thought needed to be offered to students who wanted to become teachers. I thought it needed to be classes in diversity, understanding the concept. How does it apply? What do you do to become inclusive in your classroom? A class in special education. On-site guided observations. Our students would go out for 5 weeks and observe in a school, but they didn't have to turn anything in. Now, I don't know about you, but if somebody, when I was in my teaching program, said, you have 5 weeks to just sit in a classroom, I don't think I would have taken it very seriously. English as a second language, methodology, instructional technology, and we did not have a class in classroom management in our program. I was appalled. And I asked the dean when I arrived, I said, why is that? She says, well, the professors don't think student teachers need that. I said, if you can't reach them, you can't teach them. And they said, well, they'll just pick it up. I said, you don't pick up classroom management when you got 35 kids and you're trying to supposedly teach them something. You have to have a whole set of skills before you go in the door. Now, they may not all work, because I well found out from my own experience as a young teacher. But you have to have something in your head about how you're going to handle classroom management. So, how many of you learned something today that you didn't know before? That's pretty good. I'd say maybe 60%. And I have highlighted some of the issues which face American educators today. And I thank you for your interest and attention. Now, are there any questions? Yes?
Going back to Head Start,
Yes.
I agree that it's one of the most important programs that has ever been created.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if we have it in Placerville. I don't know if we have it anywhere close at hand. And I don't know if it's funded, if it's...
It's a federal program. It's funded federally. Head Start is a federal program and funded by the federal government. Now, whether it's local, I don't know. I don't live in this county. I suspect it has one. But it is the most successful federal program, not just in education, but of all times, in all areas. Yes?
What do they identify as making that true? Why is Head Start the most successful?
They use the statistics based on completion of elementary school, high school, and college. And when you compare that demographic with kids who were the same demographic to begin with, who didn't proceed, that's what they use to show that it was a good intervention in the early years, which is the way you would do it with a longitudinal study.
What did they give these children in Head Start that created that atmosphere?
They take them on field trips. They do activities where they get them ready to read, reading readiness. They do all sorts of, even social things, how to brush your teeth, how to work and play well with others, we used to say on the back of the report card. They're the things that middle class kids would have gotten in a nursery school or in a preschool. But it's funded by the federal government for children whose parents cannot afford to do that, and it's a remarkable program. Any other questions? Yes?
I'm looking around the room and we're all older adults, thinking about the disabilities that you showed, and whether we were treated for them or not. Here we all are, and how does that affect us? How does that affect us?
That's a really good question. When I was trained as a teacher, I got my teaching credential and master's in 1971. We had nothing about special ed at all. And I had students whose parents were smart enough to see something's not working with this kid and brought them. I was teaching in Gilroy and in San Jose, and they brought them to San Jose State, where there was testing done and identified them as having dyslexia or something of that nature. I think school was a lot harder for people in our day, people who were not diagnosed. Can you be successful? Sure. But why say, I want you to walk across the room, but I want you to put a 150-pound sack of meal on your back? It's easier to do it without that. So yeah, a lot of people, it's not like, people cared, but we just did not understand the nature of these neurological issues, because neurology really wasn't what it is today, where we can, with all the imaging and stuff that they can do, and there's indicators, tests that they can give to indicate on a lot of these. So it was harder for a lot of people in our time to go through school. That's why you had a higher dropout rate. That's why you had, kids who just were not successful because they didn't have, it was so hard for them and nobody understood why it was hard. Does that answer your question?
It does, but it also helps me understand when you go to the doctors and the doctor's trying to decide whether you're competent or not, or whether you've got Alzheimer's or dementia, that maybe you don't have Alzheimer's or dementia, you've just got a learning disability that is getting in your way.
There are a lot of online tests you can do. I realized I have auditory processing disorder and probably have had it since I was a child. That's why I had a tremendously difficult time learning a foreign language. I could memorize the vocab and I could memorize the grammar, and I passed the French, Spanish, Italian, and Latin. I passed all of those competencies, but not speaking them, not listening to them, responding. It just didn't work inside my head. It just wasn't there. You would say something in a foreign language that I had been studying, and I had to envision what it looked like in words, printed words, and then translate that, and then translate the written response, then translate back to the oral response. That's a lot of energy. Yes?
Anecdotally, it seems that kids are not in the classroom as much as we were growing up. Are there studies that show the relationship between actual classroom time and the quality of the outcomes of the education?
It's the quality of the time that they have. I remember sitting in a class of a friend of mine who was teaching business English, one of the local schools in Sacramento County. And it took her 20% of the class to get her students settled. So in my class, they came in the door, there was an assignment on the board, a prompt of something they had to do while I took attendance, took in the absence notes and stuff like that, first 5 minutes, and we moved right in. I didn't have to deal with that kind of thing.
So you're saying it's a quality issue, but not a quantity issue?
I don't think more is better. I served under a principal who believed that, and I think more is just more. There's a difference between quality and quantity.
Might have more school days, but
Other countries do have more school days.
there's no studies that show that the outcomes are better where there's more school days or not.
There are some that deal with countries outside of us, but they have others. They talk about Finland as being an example. What's a homogeneous society?
Yeah.
They don't have to worry about issues of diversity. Children don't start school till they're 7. Our children start at 5. And they spend a lot of time outside during their day. The day may be longer, but they're outside playing. About every hour and a half, they have a half hour outside of play. Well, that doesn't happen in our schools. You get your 20-minute break, your 40-minute lunch, and move it on. And the teachers get 22 minutes for lunch. I'm sorry, 22 and a half when we had, 45-minute lunches. That's a good question. My own belief is it's how you use the time rather than necessarily adding additional time. We did that at the high school where I taught. We added an extra 10 minutes to the school day. I didn't see any difference in performance. What most of the teachers did was they had the students start their homework. It's called homework for a reason. They weren't using it for instruction or review or anything else. So there wasn't a change.
What about the
I don't know where this voice is. Can I see your hand? Thank you.
A hybrid model where they're introducing technology to help students learn. They're on the computer. There's a lot of videos and interactive stuff to really speed up. So they become very individualized. And you talked about the digital classroom, but now it's moving into AI where people are staying home and homeschooling. The charter school is a completely different model. They're not going to public school.
I am a shade reluctant with AI. I'm also a little reluctant for homeschooling, to be honest with you. I'd like to think that my 4 years of college, a year and a half for my master's and a year for my credential counted for something. That, anybody can open a book and say, read along with me, but there are other skills that need to be incorporated.
Public education is losing a lot of students.
I'm sorry, say again?
Public education is losing students. They're not coming back. Ever since COVID, like they left,
Yeah.
and the numbers have just
I watched my daughter teach from her kitchen during COVID. And that was a remarkable experience because she was in the kitchen. The oldest daughter was in the living room. The youngest daughter was in the dining room. And the boys were upstairs. Now, I don't know about any of you, but when I heard this dynamic, I thought, we've got a problem, Houston. And it proved out. I mean, they were just screwing around upstairs. They were 7 years old at the time. I think there's an important use of technology today in schools. I see it as an incredible, I'm sorry, I have to sit down. I fell on my knees yesterday. It's the future. I hope to God we don't go back to blackboards and chalk. Ruined my wardrobe. I had a line across my behind at the end of every day. A big chalk mark across my behind. We have to prepare them for the future. So technology is a big part of it. But we also have to prepare them to be able to critically think about what they're consuming. Understand that there's loads of things out there. As you notice, the sources I used were excellent sources. I didn't get it from somebody's vision of something. I chose government agencies that track this information statistically for that reason. It is a hard call. It's a very hard call in what's the ideal way to be. I still think if I ran the zoo, as Dr. Seuss said, I would go back to that premise that I had of critical creative systems thinkers, communicators, problem solvers, and that everything that was done, that was the overarching theme. No matter whether you taught arithmetic or you taught spelling, that's what your goal was to reinforce that specific mindset. Kind of a roundabout answer, but yes.
I'm curious about something that's come up in my education years ago. And that is, and it wasn't talked about at all, but is there an honor code taught in a classroom anymore? In any elementary, kindergarten, college, universities? It's not mentioned until something causes the principal to get involved. And I don't know, when I was at American University in Washington, D.C., I was not an American citizen yet, but I was in the process of taking an exam, and my nose started running, and I was reaching in my handbag that was on the floor for a Kleenex. And when I looked up, notice my nose starts running immediately. But when I looked up, the professor was standing at my desk. And in a voice that everyone in the classroom heard, he said, "Are you cheating?" And I looked at the Kleenex I thought I had in my hand, and it was a dollar bill. And
Did you offer it to him?
I said, "I don't know, why don't you ask the man on this bill?" I was so annoyed. And I ended up being reported to the Honor Society, which I didn't even know existed in the school. And my father got involved in it later in a discussion around the dinner table. He was educated in England fully. And he said, "Wendy, your honor is to your class, not your..." I said, "What?" And it's interesting that here's two countries, one that sort of came out of the other, that one, the honor is to your class, and in the United States, it's your honor is to yourself. But
Yeah.
why isn't it ever taught anymore?
In the U.S., because of the potential for religion being in public schools, and the fact that we are, from the very beginning, a separation of church and state, very clearly outlined in the Constitution and other documents. I think his name is Thomas Lacona, and he was a professor at one of the other campuses where I worked, and wrote a series of books that has been fairly popular on character education. And what schools have done is take one character virtue or value and emphasize it for a month. So it's in the classrooms and things like that. As far as students, I don't know. To answer your question, I don't believe so.
On the money, don't they?
Yeah,
In God we trust.
all others pay cash. Interestingly enough, that did not come about until the 1950s, that we had the addition to the Pledge of Allegiance, and the money change was not initial. Our money did not have that. But during our great fear of communism following World War II, that was added.
Scary.
This is relatively recent, but on this last week's 60 Minutes, they were talking about the gap now between male and female with regard to education. For example, now in colleges, it's like 67% female, and then even boys who are offered scholarships are not taking advantage of it. They're dropping out of education. Do you have any more insight into something like that?
I know that girls who have gone to all-girls schools do much better. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, on 60 Minutes this past week, is that correct? They talked about the fact that there's a much higher percentage of females in colleges and universities today versus males. Now, when I started college back in the 60s, we looked to see who had the best male to female ratio, was one of our deciding factors. And the University of Santa Clara at the time I was there was a 3-to-1, so our odds were very good of finding a husband and getting our MRS degree. That's a sad statement, but that is very realistic for my time and place, and the young women I grew up with. I don't know why there is this disparity today. It's as if the pendulum was way over here and then swung way back, and eventually we'll, find a balance. I think I know there are people who believe that because females have been given preferential treatment to remedy the fact that for, back to the 1600s, we didn't have it, that's unfair, and that's why these things are happening. Of course, one could argue that females are better students and more serious about their education. You know, I mean, I think you could produce a lot of arguments. I don't know, I did not see the program. I'm just, you know, supposing from that.
It's just interesting because the gap is still there as far as jobs. It's, still like 99% of the CEOs are male and.
Yeah, CEOs are still you get to a certain point, but it's the glass ceiling. You can see it, but you can't go there.
I think one of the things that I'm very, very concerned about when I see the youngsters today, I have just been privileged with a young person coming to live with me. This person is 20 years old, was homeschooled, probably not very well, whose total source of information is her phone. And what I'm seeing and also hearing on the news and other media is the lack of socialization, basic social skills, how to work cooperatively, how to resolve conflicts appropriately, and this very concerns me. And I think this is something, again, that perhaps belongs in the lap of the parents, but really, in fact, probably when we have schools, full-time schools, you learn these things on the playground. You learn these things in the principal's office. You learn these things in the classroom. And less time in the classroom, big class sizes, these social conflicts are becoming a significant issue. And social isolation of these young people is a major, major concern.
There was something in the Guardian newspaper this morning. It's a British newspaper, for those of you who don't know. I read it because I like to see what the rest of the world is thinking about us and how they're processing our events. And they said one of the biggest problems facing young people today is loneliness.
Yes.
And that just broke my heart. Loneliness. One of the biggest problems facing young people today. I mean, we associate with individuals of our age because many of us live alone and we don't have the career anymore where we were interacting, things like that. You don't expect children and teenagers to have that. That just doesn't make sense, you know, on the face of it. But it was a pretty extensive study, I guess, that was done.
Yeah.
And that saddens me.
It's frightening.
They also are not creative.
Well, yeah, that's one of the reasons why I talked about she said children are not creative to the degree that they were. Part of it is the use of media is passive, versus when my children grew up, I brought all of the overrun Xeroxes and Ditto papers that were going to go in the trash and gave them pencils and colored pencils and markers and stuff, and they drew. There wasn't, well, of course, they didn't have laptops and things in those days, yes.
When my son was getting ready to go to high school here in Placerville, we considered there's a school on the same campus as Union Mine where they have a totally different style of education. And what they do is they have the 4 years of high school, but the children are given projects. They're getting ideas. And like if they're gonna put on a play, they've got to do geometry because they've got to figure out how to build a set.
Yeah.
They're going to do literature because they're going to write the script. And it's a totally different way of looking at education. I'm wondering if you had any experience with that?
I actually do have experience with that. During the years I was teaching, well, the first story is kind of funny. I was teaching middle school, was my first job in Gilroy, the garlic capital of the world. And I thought it'd be a great idea to have the kids do the missions. We were doing California history. And so they had to submit their mission the day of Christmas vacation. And many of them made their missions out of sugar cubes. You can imagine what the classroom looked like when I came back 2 weeks later. I had no idea there were as many ants in Gilroy as there were. And they were all over my classroom. One of the activities is I believe very much in project-based learning. I really do, and I've actually taught people how to do it, and I've given conference presentations on it. While I was teaching high school, my specialty was American history, and so I thought, what if we align the social, the economic, the geographic around architecture? So each student chose, I'd formed a list of all of the different architectural styles in the United States. And they had to describe where it was, what was the geography that produced it. For example, adobe in California. You don't find that in Maine. You don't have adobe in Maine. So that was one part. How did it reflect the socioeconomics and success of the area? What were the ethnic groups that were dominant in those areas in the early years when these places were being built? And questions like that they had to form into an oral report. And then they had to build a model. And I made the stipulation, no sugar cubes. That was the only rule in the construction, no sugar cubes. Some of them were incredible. And then I had one clown who comes in, may I borrow this? Comes in with a piece of binder paper, folded in half, a little face drawn on the inside. It's an army tent. I said, well, aside from the fact that was not one of the options, it does look like you did it in the car on the way here while you were driving. No, you have 24 hours to correct this, or it's an F. This was a project for the entire quarter. And then we set up an exhibit so that the other students and faculty could come in and see it. It was really neat. Some of them got really into it in the presentation, so we saw how the people who settled the area earlier, of the earliest, had a dominant architectural style that then permeated into the kinds of things that they were building. So you saw the effect of the French, the Spanish, of the Brits, of the Germans, of the Dutch as they settled various areas, and how their architecture reflected their homeland. So you had a connection from the New World to the Old. It was a really neat project. Not well received by the administration, I might add. I thought it was a brilliant idea, personally, but I was told not to do that again because I wasn't really teaching. So after I left to go to New York to teach, apparently they hired some guru for $5,000 for an hour talk who talked exactly all about the same concept. I would have done it for free, or part of the $5,000, but no, I think it's the wave of the future because it's allowing people to integrate the different aspects of their learning. I had a colleague say to me, well, why are you having them tie their term papers to American literature? I said, because it's American history and American literature. Okay, it's like tied to what's going on historically. He says, that doesn't make any sense. I thought I'd love to meet your history teacher. It can be very frustrating. I did a lot of cutting edge stuff in those days, none of which was well received. But I'm glad I did it. I'm really glad I did it. And I taught my student teachers to do things like that. Because here's a perfect example. My first year, one of the things, in addition to the missions, I had a 6th grade class and we were studying medieval history. So I said, if you want to build a model for part of this. So the class was 43 students, and I don't completely believe in IQs as predictors of much of anything, but I had Della, who had an IQ of 70, and Pia, who had an IQ of 160, in the same class. Della made a medieval castle where she cut individual bricks out of clay and built it. And I knew her parents, so I knew this was not mom and dad doing the operation. That was extraordinary. It was an extraordinary moment to see something clicked for her. She could express her understanding in a way that, a standardized test was never going to do. But the project did do it. That's one of the reasons I'm such a firm believer in. And in a lot of jobs, you're assigned a project to do. Why not start early?
Trade schools. Trade schools.
Yeah. Yes?
I just have a personal question to ask you about where you're off to tomorrow.
I am heading to the Himalayas.
Will you be giving this lecture in English?
I'm not giving this lecture there. I am speaking in...
But I wondered why this lecture would be given in any other country.
No, it's specifically for this group. I wrote it for this group.
Okay.
I'm going to India and Thailand. And I'm giving a presentation at a teacher college on methodology, and then I'm speaking at a conclave in Bangkok. One is on concept-based education, one is on leadership in general, and then because Thailand is 92% Buddhist, my presentation is the other presentation's tied to the Eightfold Path of Buddhism, how you can use that to become a leader. So those are the three I'm doing there. And I'll sleep for about the next 6 months. I do this twice a year. I go to Thailand once and India once.
I graduated from high school in Arlington County, and everyone was going to Europe. Their parents had given them money to go to Europe. And I had to go back to Europe every summer of my life because coming to America, I had to spend time with the grandparents. And I, in 1962, went to a travel agent without asking my parents, got visas and everything, and I went to India for 3 months in 1962.
Wow.
And I think it was the best education I ever got.
I learn more from these experiences, I think, than I teach.
I think that if we get out of America and see what the rest of the world is doing, it makes you really appreciate how
We also have to suspend our perceptions of the way things must be or should be.
But I think your lecture was most informative.
Thank you. Thank you, I appreciate that. I put a lot of time into these. The presentations I do, I used to do 3-hour ones when I started this work, and I said, I'm too old to be doing a 3-hour presentation for the teacher colleges. And I said, I can't be on my feet that long. So I do an hour now.
But every state in this country teaches differently.
Yes. They have different requirements. For example, New York and New Jersey certify teachers as a bachelor's degree. California, at least as far back as the 1930s, when my mother and my aunt got their teaching credentials, you had to have a clear bachelor's degree and then did a program of, I want to say maybe 36 credits for a teaching credential. But others, my daughter was certified in New Jersey as an undergraduate. She had to have an academic major, but she was certified as a teacher in New Jersey.
Well, with an Arlington County education, I was teaching at the university level right out of.
I don't think it's a good idea. Personally, I think especially if you're teaching high school, you need to have a really strong academic background in your content area. You really do, and I think we do a disservice to the students who are in that situation. I had students say to me, "You make it look so easy." And I said, I've been doing this for 40 years. If I'm still stumbling around, there's a problem. You know, it takes years to perfect this profession.
I think it's wonderful you're still doing it.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I've got a couple more years I can do this. They got me a 5-year India visa, so we'll see whether my legs and I can make this trip again.
You'll enjoy it.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a remarkable country. Anything else? Anything else like that? Thank you. Thank you.